So, what are the characteristics of your proposal? So, you're making a business case, you're trying to make a convincing, persuasive argument so that you can get what you want. So, what are the elements that you need to build together to make that happen? So, the first one, I suppose, and potentially that this might be the most important one, is that you very clearly articulate what the benefits are going to be if someone was to give you the support and the resources to do what you're proposing, and also why you need that resource to do what you want. So, why should they commit the resources to you anyway? What's the point of it? And I suppose if you don't have that kind of gap analysis or needs analysis done, it becomes difficult then to be able to articulate those benefits and so on. So, from a laboratory context, you could have operational benefits. So, maybe you're looking for a new type of analyzer or some new automation within the lab, which means that things might work better on a day to day basis. So, that's one aspect of it. However, that operational aspect might also feed into clinical aspects as well, because if you have a new piece of equipment that works more quickly, perhaps you'll be able to get results back to clinicians and back to the wards and GPs faster than you have before, which may have a benefit too. And I mean, obviously, if you think about things like point of care, arguably some of these benefits come from that, if we take that simple example. And then you also have the financial benefits, potentially. So let's say you're doing manual assays at the moment, and then you can automate those assays. Maybe that frees up 1.5 whole-time equivalent employees to do something else. So there's a variety of different benefits that you could articulate as part of that needs and benefits analysis side of things. Now, I've given a kind of fairly straightforward example there with getting an automation so that you can create additional resources, let's say within the lab, and you can enable the lab to work more efficiently. But it could be that you need an extra person. It could be that you need more admin support. It could be that you need a complete restructuring of your built environment and the organization of a laboratory. But all of those things, ultimately, you need to make that case for that it works at an operational, clinical, financial, and other levels. There may be a human resource or an IR aspect that would come into it as well. So if you've had, coming back to the automation example, if you've had a lot of people who are doing very menial tasks and getting frustrated with that, as we've seen before, from a conflict point of view, if you allow people to continue to do those menial tasks, then they can become very, very bored and very frustrated with those. So if you could create an environment where people are not doing those menial tasks as much because you've automated them, that might actually head off some sort of core staff disquiet and potentially industrial relations issue. So you're actually getting a benefit in a different way. Now, it's more difficult to articulate those, but often those things actually have a huge benefit as well. But again, it's a more intangible benefit. We'll come back to that idea for evidence later on, because you can see it's evidence-based for needs and objectives later on. So once you've got the idea of what you want to do, the next step is to actually really distill that down very carefully and very clearly state the objectives. And this can be a difficult one because sometimes people misinterpret the difference between objectives and goals. So a goal would be something more like, we're going to reconfigure that bench to make it more automated. Okay, so that's, quite broad. It's quite high level, but the objectives are the specific steps or the specific work plans or tasks that are required to achieve that goal. And an objective needs to be measurable. So I'm sure you've heard the terminology of SMART goals or SMART objectives. So specific, measurable, achievable, and timely and realistic. And those objectives really are needed because it's hard to make a convincing case if you don't have very clear objectives setting out what you're going to do, because the objectives are going to give you those pass-fail moments. Have you done this? Yes. Okay, you can do go on to the next one. Have you done this? No. Well, why not? And no, you can't go on to the next step, for example. And we'll come back to that maybe a little bit more detail in some of the project management things. So those needs and benefits, those objectives, they actually all need to be evidence-based. So we've discussed this idea of maybe automation as an easy to use example. So if it turns out that automation actually is the optimal solution, then maybe that's the one that you're going to use, but you need to have the evidence for that. So what are the costs doing it the way you're doing it? What are the costs of not changing? What are the costs of changing? And I don't necessarily just mean financial costs, okay? Because you can have direct pay costs clearly, but you can also have non-pay costs. And I don't just mean, again, reagents in this case, or consumables or equipment. I also mean opportunity costs, so lost ability to do something else. So if you have 3 people who are working on doing some manual task, and you could automate that and one person could take care of it. Now you have 2 other people who can do something else. So they have the opportunity now to focus on something else, and that other thing could be of benefit to the lab. So not allowing them to do those other things is actually a cost of a lost opportunity to the lab. So maybe that's not something that you're familiar with already, but it's useful to think in those terms. And obviously you're always going to be aiming for that optimal solution. And you're going to try and aim for an optimal solution that doesn't break the bank and provides enhanced abilities and capacity within the laboratory setting. But underpinning everything really, I suppose, is going to be that clinical evidence. And often that's the way that you can get change driven within the lab, because you can make something happen faster, you can get results quicker, you can be more precise, more accurate. You can have a new diagnostic approach that markedly improves patient outcomes and so on. So that's where all the clinical evidence comes in. And really it's those patient outcomes that are critically important here. That if you're benefiting a patient, then that is the clinical evidence that you need to justify your business case. So if the benefits are towards the patient based on that hard clinical evidence, so patients spend 2 days less time in hospital if we have this new test. So it costs much more to have lots of patients in a hospital for extra days than it does to pay for the equipment or resources or reagents or personnel to run that test. So it's actually a saving to the healthcare system, and it's an overall benefit to the healthcare system if you can bring that in. Now, it's important that whenever you have a plan, you need to figure out what the risks might be. Now, I'm sure you've all seen risk registers, or at least heard of them, and that's a formal approach to kind of capturing all of the different risks and weighing up the risks that might actually derail your proposal or your project. You need to accept that there is always a risk in any proposal and in any project. But if you can recognize it, you can assess it, and you can plan for it. And if you can plan for it, then that means you can potentially avoid getting stuck somewhere because you didn't kind of have a contingency plan when something happens. So let's take the automation example. So we need to get the automation in. We get the green light to do it, and then it turns out when the engineers come to try and install it, they find they don't have the right type of power supply, the water isn't the right quality, they need to have a new gas line, or whatever it is. If you haven't considered that risk aspect ahead of time, then you could get very unstuck in your proposal, and you could fail to meet an objective that you could have fully accepted to meet or expected to meet. So it's not that you can cover absolutely every risk, but you're really looking to identify what are the high risk things that will derail things. Low risk things you can kind of tolerate, let's say, or absorb. It's really those high risk things that if you do nothing, something bad will happen. They're the ones you have to really intervene quickly. And the last point then is that in any kind of proposal like this, you're going to have multiple players involved and multiple stakeholders. So if you want to go and redesign an entire bench in a lab, you're going to have the higher management and more senior management of the lab involved in that. And if you want to have, let's say, IT involved because it's going to be an automated system, then you're going to have to talk to the information support and information services department. But you also need to have someone who's going to be the sponsor of the project. You might need to have someone who acts as a kind of a pathfinder in the project, i.e. if there's a major problem or you just can't seem to get something to happen, that person goes and, opens the way to enable it to be fixed. They're able to make the right calls to the right people who are at the right level of seniority to make things happen that maybe at a senior level in a lab you may not be able to do. So those are the kind of broad characteristics of a proposal, the different elements that go into making up a proposal. And we'll drill into some of the details of those as we go through the next sections.